Hello, I'm Ads, and today I'll be showing you how I paint my Sautekh Scarab Swarms. I'll talk a bit about technique as well as how to scuff a surface with painted detail. So I'm starting in a bit of an odd place here. Because these new push fit scarabs are just pressed in and sit very close to the base, I've already sorted the bases out. My basing is fairly basic and I've opted not to put crystals on because I wasn't sure about how they'd fit on. Maybe next time. I sprayed just the scarabs with lead belcher and the bases with a black spray primer before adding my usual basing material to it. I then pushed the scarabs onto the base, though if you're not super comfortable and fear you'll splash paint around the base, you can leave them off and hold them by the peg instead. I start with a generous layer of Nuln oil across all the scarabs, trying to let it rest on all the internals to darken down the recesses and give a bit of separation in there. An all over coat also lets the rest of the paint stick better to the smooth primer coat. With that dry, I take Unbreakable and start to relayer the silvers to bring the brightness back up. Relayering is simply just adding another coat of paint onto the model, but with one thing in mind. Try and leave some of the darkened base coat showing around the edges. Finding how far you like to push your layer is up to you. I like to mix it up to try and keep a sense of depth where it's needed by leaving a bigger section of base coat showing in places. The last step on the silvers is to edge highlight them using Stormhost Silver. Edge highlighting can be quite intimidating when you're learning this stuff. It's quite precise and time consuming to do. A couple tips to help you out with it. Firstly, I thin my paint a little more than I do for relayering to edge with. It helps the paint to run smoothly from the brush and that'll make it much easier. Secondly, the way that you use the brush can help you out too. Where possible, you want to be running the side of the brush to about a 45-degree angle to the edge. Running it perpendicular will transfer the paint, but you often don't get enough on the edge that you can see it. That extra angle to the bristles will transfer a bit of paint across the top surface. In some areas, you need to use the tip as there isn't a hard enough edge to run it against. You just want to take your time there and use short sweeps of the brush to continue that line. Lastly is to prioritise comfort of your brushing hand over the hand holding the model. If you're sweeping your brush comfortably, you're going to make less mistakes than craning around the model. I'm mostly comfortable with a downward brush stroke, so I turn the painting handle to meet that instead of the other way around. Now onto the carapace. I take matte black and completely cover the carapace of the scarab. I thin the black quite a bit here to an almost ink-like consistency and layer up in several passes to build solid black in. This ensures that I get a smooth coat and that I don't clog up any chips out of the carapace. I also use this to disguise the moulded structural tabs that are between some of the scarab's legs and bodies. A bit of patience and a sharp scalpel might be all that's needed to pop these out, but I was worried about breaking them, so I left them on there and painted them black. Looks fine, I promise. Next I glaze in some Caliban green around the edge of the black areas. I covered glazing in my Warriors tutorial, so feel free to click the card to check that out for a more in-depth look at that. But to summarise, I heavily water down the paint and pull from the black out to the edge of the carapace. A few passes of this will fool the eye into seeing a really deep green catching some light around the edges. Then I take Warpstone Glow and edge highlight the green, taking care about the brush not hitting the base or any adjacent scarabs. I make a lot of mistakes at this point with the edge highlighting. They can and do happen, and that's okay. Knowing how to fix mistakes can lessen your stress with this, so let me quickly run over how to go about that. If paint gets somewhere that it shouldn't, like a recess or transfer to the surrounding detail, quickly wash out your brush, and while still damp, run the brush back over the area that's splodged. The water will dilute the paint, so keep washing out your dirty brush and running it over there until your mistake's gone. If you're noticing long after the fact, you'll need to bring back your other paints and just touch up that area. Similarly, if you're running an edge and it's too thick or wavy, let it dry in and bring back the colour you painted over, and paint on the other side of the edge to bring it back to where you want it. Not panicking is the biggest thing though. Most everything is fixable with the painting part of minis, just might take a bit of work at times. Whilst I'm highlighting, I'll also draw in some cracks and scuff onto some areas of the carapace, just wherever I think it'll add a bit of interest. All I'm doing is picking a spot and lightly drawing lines from that spot. Whether the wavy lines like a cracked impact or a straight chip like a sword impact is up to you. Keeping that thinner consistency will let you draw in and leave a faint line where you can then draw back over with more paint to emphasize the crack. Freehanding can be very intimidating, but cracks and scuffs are a good way to get you started on doing it without worrying about making something look bad. It's a crack, you can't get it wrong. And the last step is to point highlight with moot green. A point highlight is exactly what it sounds like, a point of brighter colour to add emphasis and contrast to your edges. Strictly speaking, I run a tiny line across either side of the point with the scarabs as I want these edges to look sharp. A thinner, smaller edge running towards the brighter point sells this effect nicely. I'll also add points to the wider areas of the cracks I drew in earlier with the warpstone glow. As an additional step, I felt like some of these cracks could be sold better as deeper, almost like shards are missing from a real deep impact. So I took some matte black and drew a black line inside some of the areas to make them look like really deep scuffs. Simple trick, but it looks really nice. For the faceplates, I like a cold white to tie them into my Cryptex and other Canoptek units. To start, I lay down a smooth base coat of Celestra Grey. Like with the black, I thin this down quite a bit so as not to clog any detail on the face. I then relayer the whole faceplate with Ulthuan Grey. This gives the appearance that the face is white without using a pure white colour, so I can highlight with that later. I next thin down some Gryph-Charger Grey contrast paint and start bringing a blue-grey shadow to the bottom half of the faceplate for a bit of contrast. I also run this around the eye lens to keep the rim of the eye quite dark. Finally, I use white ink to run an edge highlight around the whole faceplate, as well as the lower part of the eye recess to make it look like it's catching light from above. Lastly, there's just the bright core and eye of the scarabs left, so I take Corax white and carefully base those in over a couple thin coats. You have to be a little careful at this point, as some white transfer can be a pain to remove if you let it dry in. Again, should this happen, and it might well, it's a tricky spot to get to, quickly rinse out your brush and pass it back and forth over the mistake with just water. Failing that, bring back matte black and carefully touch back up the dried in mistakes. Next I bring back moot green and relayer over the white areas. Again, I'm being very careful to try and avoid transferring paint against the carapace. I've gone to a smaller brush to help out with that, and I'm building in a solid smooth green with a couple thin coats of paint. Then I do one last relayer, this time with green fluo. Again, being cautious with the application, as I just want the core and eye of the Scarab to glow, not the surrounding carapace. Lastly with the Scarabs, I want a bright hotspot to these green areas, so I take Gauss Blaster Green and thin it a little more than I would for relayering. I drag the paint in on the orb from the outside to the centre to build up a bright green gradient. A small dot is all that's needed for the eye. And finally, I use white ink to drop a dot right in the middle of the green gradient for the hottest point. And with the base rimmed, the Scarab Swarm is complete. These things are nice and quick to paint up and look great alongside the other boys. Hopefully the little deep dive on technique can help out those newer to painting minis. If I missed anything or you have any questions or feedback, feel free to leave a comment below and I'll get back to you. Thanks for watching, good luck with your Scarabs, and I'll see you again soon.